And Simeon blessed them and said to his mother Mary, "This child is destined for the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be opposed, so that the inner thoughts of many will be revealed. And a sword will pierce your own soul too." Life, our lives, can be very bittersweet. We can go from moments of great joy and celebration to moments of loss and sorrow and a feeling that all is futile. And we go back and forth between these two depending on what's happening in our lives. One of the moments that comes to me is that moment on 9/11 back in 2001, which I suspect most of you remember, which was one of the great, great tragedies that's ever happened in our country, where the Twin Towers were destroyed and over 3,000 people died. And what I remember most vividly about that experience of watching on television as those mammoth towers came crashing down was the shared grief that we all had over this thing that had happened in our country, which I at least never thought could happen in our country. I thought we were separated enough from all the crazies that we wouldn't see anything like that in this country. I remember that, but I also remember a phone call that I received either the same day or the next day from a young couple in my parish who ironically were planning to be married on the Saturday immediately following 9/11. And they were really struggling with this because they were afraid that their family and guests would feel like this was somehow not appropriate to have a moment of great celebration and joy right on the heels of the biggest tragedy that ever happened in our country. And they were leaning towards postponing the wedding because it just didn't feel right to them. We had a wonderful conversation. I remember at the end of that conversation, we finally agreed that we would have the wedding as scheduled. Because as I pointed out to them on the phone, this is what life is about. It's a mixture of joy and sadness, and we alternate from one to the other. And somehow it felt like if we postponed the wedding, then the terrorists would have won. So we decided to do the wedding, but to make sure that it was done in the context of not losing sight of or forgetting what had just happened. So as we gathered in a meadow in Vermont, of all places, and stood there for what was supposed to be a very joyful occasion, I began the service by inviting people to remember what had just happened. And we had a long period of silence as we recalled all the people who had died and all of their families who'd suffered this catastrophic loss. And then I said a prayer, and then we moved into the celebration of the moment, into the wedding. And I think everybody felt like it was just perfect. I don't do that very often, but this went really well. And although there were some people who couldn't get there because, as you may remember, all the flights were grounded throughout the United States, and they had family members who were supposed to be coming from Paris for this event who couldn't get there, but the people who came felt like this is right. In the midst of death, in the midst of loss, in the midst of all the horrible things that had happened, we should come together and gather and celebrate life and celebrate a new future for this couple. I've had occasions like that in my ministry often, and as I thought about it, I can remember several young couples who had a brand new child on the same day that one of the grandparents died. And so there was this mixture of feelings and a difficulty about how do we figure this out, how do we deal with this. And I can remember doing baptisms where the family had more or less just come from the funeral of the grandparent who had died and who would not be around to celebrate the joy of this child growing up and all that that portends for the child and for the family. But there again, that's life. Life can be bittersweet. Life can be a moment of joy and then a moment of real sadness. And sometimes they get all mixed together in ways that we struggle to understand and to deal with. You may have seen us fussing up here at the lectern about where the readings were for today, because today is normally the fourth Sunday after Epiphany, but on this particular year, because it's February 2nd, it's also the feast day of the presentation, which is an important event in Jesus' life and which we are invited to celebrate in place of the fourth Sunday after Epiphany. I got to tell you that as I prepared my sermon on the presentation, I had a moment of panic when I thought, what happens if I get here and they pick the other reading? I had a plan, but it's nice that we are on the same page literally about what we were going to do today. The Feast of the Presentation was the occasion 40 days after the birth of the child, where the family was directed by their Jewish faith to come to the temple in Jerusalem and to literally give their firstborn son over to God. It was exactly what happened, as you probably remember from the Old Testament, with the prophet Samuel, who grew up in the temple because he had been given by his family in service to God. But there is a sort of an escape clause in all this, I think you could say, in that if the family offers up turtle doves or pigeons as a sacrifice, they can be a substitute. And so when the ceremonial sacrifice of these birds was offered, then the family got to take the child home. This was a standard religious event in that culture, not unlike the baptisms that Christian churches do all over the world. Sort of, it's not routine for the family, but it's sort of a routine service within our church. But as we heard in today's gospel, there was nothing routine about what happened on that day. Mary and Joseph may have come with the expectation that they would get this over with and go home. But it was different because of who was there. There was Anna, a very old priest who had been in that church prophet rather, than been in that church for that temple for a long, long time, waiting for the coming of the Messiah. And when Anna saw Jesus, she knew that this was the Messiah, and that long wait was over. And then there was Simeon, a very old man who was hanging on to his life long enough for the Messiah to come. And when Mary and Joseph walked in, cradling this little boy, he knew that his wait was over and that the Messiah was here. And we heard those wonderful words that Simeon offered, which were both a moment of excitement for Mary and Joseph, but also scared the fool out of them, because he talked about the fact of who Jesus was, and that Jesus, as he grew up, would touch the hearts and souls of people all over Israel. But then he concluded by saying to Mary, "A sword will pierce your heart too." Excitement, prospects for the future, but not ultimately a good outcome for her. It was like in that one sentence, Simeon was predicting the way all of this was going to unfold, and who Jesus was to be, and what his ministry was going to be like, and ultimately what would happen to it. It really grabbed people, as it does us today. Life is very bittersweet, and we take the good with the bad. four gospel writers, Luke is the only one who pays attention to Jesus as a child. And he raises up in three very vivid stories things we need to know about how Jesus grew up that foreshadowed who he was to become. There is the feast day 8 days after Jesus was born, which in our calendar turns out to be New Year's Day. It's not a red-hot day for worship services, I gotta tell you. I always had that service, and the 4 or 5 of us who came liked it a lot. It's the feast day of the circumcision, which was a very important service where Jesus was ceremonially welcomed into the church. And then 40 days after, we heard the presentation today. And then there's one more critical event, which I bet you remember, where Jesus and Mary and Joseph, he's 12 years old, and they're in Jerusalem, and Jesus disappears. And Mary and Joseph are terrified that they've lost him. And they find him in the temple, and it's one of the few times where I think Jesus was actually annoyed with his mother, because he said to her, "Don't you know that I'm here about my Father's work?" These stories help to set the stage for what is about to happen. It helps us to know who Jesus was as a human being and what Jesus was being prepared to do. As I said, life can be for all of us very bittersweet. And one of the things that enables us to deal with it is the same thing that sustained Simeon and Anna through their very long lives. The knowledge that no matter what happens to us, Jesus will stand by and sustain us in this life, and then ultimately